Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a hammer to one of the most deeply entrenched assumptions in international relations theory, the idea that when it comes to global governance, only sovereign states actually matter. We are going to deconstruct the International Labor Organization, which is this century-old, massive anomaly in the international system that proves global governance can operate in a radically different way. For students of international relations, if you really want to understand how rules are made and enforced on the world stage, you have to look past the traditional treaties and militaries and zoom right in on the specialized agencies that translate high-minded principles into actual on-the-ground practice.
Here is our roadmap for today as we analyze how this institution navigates an anarchic global system. 1. Born from the ashes. 2. The unique tripartite model. 3. Crafting international labor standards. 4. Enforcing the unenforceable. 5. Declarations and decent work. And finally, 6. Global governance in action. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Born from the ashes. The historical foundations of a global experiment. To really grasp why the ILO is such a unique player in the international system today, we have to rewind to its origins. It represents the very first major international effort to bake socioeconomic rights directly into global governance.
The history here is just, well, it's wild from an IR perspective. The ILO was literally built from the rubble of the First World War in 1919, written right into the Treaty of Versailles. And what is absolutely incredible is its institutional survival. I mean, it survived the total collapse of the League of Nations. It even managed to pull in the United States in 1934, which was the absolute height of American isolationism. Eventually, in 1946, it seamlessly transitioned to become the very first specialized agency of the newly formed UN, a legacy that ultimately earned it the Nobel Peace Prize in 1969.
And if you want to understand the philosophical bedrock driving this whole machine, listen to this quote from the landmark Declaration of Philadelphia, which was drafted right in the middle of World War II. Poverty anywhere constitutes a danger to prosperity everywhere. It makes this undeniable direct connection between domestic social justice and international peace and security. It's basically arguing that you literally cannot have a stable, peaceful global order if you are tolerating massive economic exploitation inside individual states.
Moving on to Section 2, the unique tripartite model, defying the sovereign state assumption. Now we get into the actual institutional machinery, and this completely disrupts that classic IR theory telling us that international organizations are strictly intergovernmental clubs.
The absolute core of this is the tripartite governance structure. So at the International Labour Conference, which people often call the International Parliament of Labour, every single one of the 187 member states sends 4 delegates. 2 represent the government, 1 represents employers, and 1 represents workers. But here is the massive kicker for us as students of global governance. Those worker and employer delegates can, and constantly do, vote completely independently of their own sovereign governments. They have a totally independent, equal voice.
Let's break down the 56 titular members of the governing body, which acts as the ILO's Executive Council. You get that perfect tripartite balance, 28 governments, 14 employers, and 14 workers. But look closer at that government number. Out of those 28 seats, 10 are permanently locked in for states of chief industrial importance, meaning powerhouses like the US, China, Germany, and Brazil. It's a really brilliant nuance to study because it subtly acknowledges hard geopolitical and economic power right inside an otherwise highly progressive, egalitarian framework.
Section 3. Crafting international labor standards. Creating the rules of the game. So with that wild structure established, let's talk about the actual output of this tripartite machinery, managed day-to-day by the 3,500 officials at the International Labor Office in Geneva.
To understand how international law is formulated here, you have to look at their dual approach, hard law paired with soft guidance. The ILO has produced over 190 conventions since 1919. The second a member state ratifies one, boom, it becomes hard law, creating a legally binding treaty obligation. But these are supplemented by recommendations, which are non-binding guidelines. You don't ratify them, but they offer highly detailed advice to shape national policy. It's just a really elegant pairing of hard obligations and practical direction. But they take it a step further. To build a foundational baseline for the whole global economy, the ILO identified 8 fundamental conventions and bundled them into 4 core principles: freedom of association, eliminating forced labor, abolishing child labor, and ending discrimination. And you really need to grasp this next part.
These 4 principles are considered universally binding on all member states simply by virtue of them being in the organization. It literally does not matter if a state officially ratified the specific underlying conventions. That is an incredibly bold mechanism in international law.
Section 4. Enforcing the unenforceable. The compliance puzzle in an anarchic system. All right, this brings us face to face with basically the most famous dilemma in our field. How on earth does a global institution enforce its rules when it doesn't have a standing army or a global police force?
So how does the ILO ensure compliance without hard enforcement powers? I really want you to think about this critically. When a sovereign state just decides to ignore a labor standard, the ILO cannot invade them or slap on unilateral sanctions. Instead, it relies on what has to be one of the most sophisticated soft law mechanisms in the international system. It leans entirely on supervision, mandatory reporting, and a very public, very intense process of naming and shaming to influence how states behave.
The absolute backbone of this is the regular supervisory system. It kicks off with Article 22 reporting, where states are basically forced to hand in their homework, submitting periodic reports on how they're implementing conventions. Then, the CEACR steps in. That is, a committee of 20 top-tier, independent legal experts from around the world who publish totally neutral, technical observations on those reports. Finally, you have the Conference Committee on the Application of Standards, which publicly pulls governments with bad records up on stage and grills them in an open, tripartite debate. It's basically the ultimate international hot seat.
Now, when standard reporting just isn't cutting it and things get really heated, the ILO escalates through its special procedures. This can start with representations filed directly by workers or employers, escalate to formal complaints, and culminate in a commission of inquiry, the absolute highest level of investigation they have. Oh, and there's also the uniquely powerful Committee on Freedom of Association. They can investigate trade union violations against a state, even if that state hasn't ratified the specific convention. Yet again, a massive departure from normal treaty law.
Section 5. Declarations and decent work. The moral and strategic compass. Beyond the binding legal texts and the complex enforcement machinery we just talked about, the ILO also throws around some immense political weight through landmark declarations that set the moral tone for global labor.
Today, their modern strategic focus is completely anchored around the decent work agenda, built on rights at work, employment, social protection, and social dialogue. What is really brilliant about this from an institutional standpoint is how seamlessly they've integrated their specific, niche mandate into the massive overarching UN 2030 sustainability goals, specifically locking in Sustainable Development Goal 8.
Finally, Section 6, Global Governance in Action. Friction between ideals and state sovereignty. As students of global governance, we cannot just stay in the realm of theory. We absolutely have to look at what happens when these lofty principles inevitably collide with the harsh reality of state sovereignty.
Let's ground this discussion in some hard data, because it clearly exposes the limits of soft law. Consider the geopolitical reality of ratification gaps. As of 2025, China has ratified only 7 of the 10 fundamental conventions. The United States, despite holding one of those permanent executive seats we discussed, has incredibly only ratified 14 of the 190 total conventions. And then there's the money. The ILO's entire $930 million biennial budget for 2026 to 2027 is currently threatened by unpaid dues from its absolute top donor, the U.S. That kind of financial squeeze literally paralyzes the organization's ability to provide crucial technical assistance. Hard power still plays a huge role.
So I'll leave you with this provocative question to ponder. The ILO is an absolute survivor. It has lasted over a century, navigating world wars and massive geopolitical shifts. Does its survival prove that well-designed, multi-stakeholder models can actually overcome global anarchy? Or, when we look at today's glaring ratification gaps and crippling funding crises, are we just reaching the absolute limits of what soft law and naming and shaming can achieve? Think about how these dynamics will shape the future of international relations. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures of our global system.